Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Grant Swartzwelder, President of OTA Environmental Solutions, and your host for today's Oilfield Strong presentation. As you know, we record these and put them onto YouTube. Urge you to follow that YouTube station because it's really growing with the number of presentations and I think quality of presentations, if I can say so myself, especially with our guest Lee today. Next Oilfield Strong presentation will be Sarah Stogner, who ran for Railroad Commission. She's a little bit of a lightning rod, and you say, well, why is she on? And same reason we've had Environmental Defense Fund, and we've had regulators, and we've had company folks. I think it's good to hear all different perspectives of, and you know, if you listen to her, there are some good points she makes. It's sometimes how she makes it, we can discuss. But I think it will be lively at least. So, but with that, I am so happy to introduce Lee Fuller. He has been with IPAA since 1998, I believe. Basically oversees their efforts in the regulatory side, the compliance side, has a prior history in working in private industry on the consulting side, lobbying side, and most importantly, has an engineering degree. So can actually understand a lot of the issues because of the engineering background. So that makes him a very good one to talk to. I think one of the main reasons I was excited about having Lee here is that with his focus in IPAA, it's really talking about the independent producer, which so many of our attendees are, and so many of the people out in Midland are, because all the regulatory environmental stuff is going to affect them, I think, more than others, or we'll let Lee speak to that. But Lee, welcome, glad you're here. Let me start off just so that everyone understands kind of what is it that IPAA is trying to do. And because there are, you know, Midland, there's PBPA, there's OIPA, there's others, but from a national standpoint, and probably as important as any of that is how is it working with Steve Pruitt? I know he's chairman, and I've known Steve a long time, and I'll sit you up for you can either go high or you can go low, and I'm fine either way.
Well, Steve is one of the most energetic people I think I've met in a long, long time, and he's also a very intelligent guy, and engages on these issues. And he's, as you're well aware, he's pretty aggressive about getting into issues and kind of pushing the organization. So it's been a delight to work with him. He's been very, very interested in moving IPAA forward. We've had the COVID and oil price crisis really hampered a lot of activity that we've done in the past, and we're kind of coming out of that now, trying to move forward. We've got a lot of challenges. This administration, the Congress, and the regulators, as a part of the administration, pose a substantial number of issues: environmental, federal land access, offshore availability. Tax issues will be on the table as always in one form or another, though the tightness of the Congress makes it doubtful that we'll see any major tax modifications. Anyway, it's going to be it's an exciting time if you like movement and activity.
Exciting to you might be worrisome to some others.
and rightfully so. And rightfully so.
So let's talk about that independent, or that kind of that mid-sized company that, you know, you look at it and they say anyone below 25 tons, like methane tax, a lot of things, it won't really affect you. You don't have to do greenhouse, you know, various regulatory stuff under 25,000 tons. Above that you do. And then you've got these larger companies that either because of their production or because of their lobbying or whatever, don't seem to be affected. So it seems like it's that middle ground, lower middle ground, that are really the ones that could they're going to get impacted the most, and probably the most negatively. Is that fair, or what am I missing?
I think that's certainly an accurate characterization of the dynamics that are going to confront us. If you look at the history of regulation dynamics with oil and gas production, It's really been somewhat late to the party. Most of the regulatory programs in the past tend to focus on urban areas. And because at the time, oil and gas production was both largely rural and largely comprised of smaller well sites, 1 or 2 wells per site, the regulatory regimes really didn't move into that arena as aggressively as it did for, let's say, a refinery or a steel plant or a chemical plant. But over the past couple of decades, the confluence of both the fact that a lot of other things are regulated and the evolution of climate as a substantial issue that draws attention, with methane being a key aspect of that attention. We've really seen movement towards the oil and gas industry much more aggressively. The other factor is the regulators are not well versed in understanding the nature of oil and gas production, which leads us to a lot of challenges there. And then you start getting into the dynamics of the scope of the industry, ranging from very large publicly traded companies down to mom and pop operations. That's essentially the range that IPAA deals with. We deal only with exploration and production. We're not into the downstream. And so as you look at these things that get framed out, while Congress will say, yeah, we're going to go after big oil and we're going to make them do things, in reality, almost all the time, what happens is the burden falls much more heavily on independent producers, whether it's tax issues or regulatory issues. Some of that is because of the capital demands that are on the industry, and some of it, of course, are because, particularly at the smaller end, you're dealing with low production operations that just have a very different economic cost effectiveness test that ought to be applied, but frequently isn't. If we're looking at this new methane tax, it's a very different animal. It's something that's never been done before. The history of it is very troubling, because essentially it was written in secret. There were no hearings. There's no reports written in the committee or in the conference that explain how it's supposed to work. There was no floor debate. So essentially you have this raw legislative language that sits there being handed to EPA to implement. There are elements of it that are intended to try to limit its impact on the small end of operations. The 25,000 ton per year per basin threshold that you mentioned is there for that reason. But just to put that in context, that's like 1,000 metric tons of methane. So when you're dealing with methane, it's a much smaller threshold than if you're dealing with carbon dioxide, because it's a 25,000 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and the ratio for methane is 25 to 1. The second aspect of it is it's got more or less three components to it. The first component is, if you're filing under the Subpart W greenhouse gas reporting program, that's where the 25,000 ton applies, but it's for carbon dioxide equivalent. It's for everything that you emit, and it's per basin. That 25,000 ton number was crafted for the greenhouse gas inventory with the idea that it would, take a lot of smaller operators out of the reporting, which is burdensome in and of itself. But it was done, for example, before gathering and boosting was a part of the greenhouse gas inventory. And what we've learned recently is that the gathering boosting, because the emissions factor for it is so rough, can pull a lot of people in, even though they may not emit nearly what the emissions factors would do. And the way the Subpart W works is you basically are applying an emissions factor to a piece of equipment. Whether that factor is good or not is a big question. We have lots of problems with it. Pneumatic controllers are probably the easiest example. Intermittent pneumatic controllers, the emissions factor for that's based on 19 controllers taken back in sometime in the mid-1990s, never intended for the purpose that it's now being asked to do. The first part of the methane tax is that EPA is supposed to go back and revise that subpart W and make it better. But at the same time, the timeline for when the tax is going to take place, which is basically at the end of 2024, taxes due in 2025, is in my view, way too short a time for EPA to do the kind of work it needs to do for the emissions factor. So that's your first threshold. Second threshold is it's called an excess emissions fee. So it'll have a volume of emissions compared to your total production. And there's a factor for different segments of the industry: production, pipelines, gathering and boosting. It differs from oil to gas. The gas factor for production is 0.2% of emissions over natural gas sales. Neither of those terms are defined. So one of the big questions is the emissions are calculated in tons, but sales are typically calculated in volume. And it's natural gas volume. So how do you calculate that now? Nobody knows that yet. We're waiting to see EPA come out with a rulemaking to implement that. But obviously the way you calculate that can influence whether you're subjected to the tax or not. The tax then falls on the amount of emissions over that 0.2 threshold. For gathering and boosting, it's a much lower threshold. I think it's about 0.05%. But I'm not sure of that. Need to go check the law on that one. And for oil, where you don't have very much associated gas, the number is really low for that. So it can capture people who really weren't the intent of this as well. But what happens in terms of your producer dynamic is emissions basically sort of reach a point where if you have enough pieces of equipment, you're going to have a certain amount of emissions. And obviously, the more production you have, the easier it is to drop that number down. So an intermediate sized producer may have good emissions controls, but still because of his gas sales or the gas sales, they can fall into that above that 0.2 number, and now they're into the tax pool. The final big piece of it is to link to the EPA regulatory program that's currently under development. And if you are in a state and you're complying with all the EPA regulations written in a way that's pretty complicated, then you can also be excluded from the tax. But those regulations are going to have a different timeline than the tax. The tax, as I said, is based on 2024 as its first year. The regulatory process, probably for existing sources, isn't going to produce regulations until the end of 2027. So even if you're doing a good job, you don't have anything to comply with. And there's a lot of issues around the regulations we can talk about if you wish later on. So that's the framework. A couple of other dynamics, though, which can be, I think, really troubling depending upon how EPA writes its regulations, is that this whole program has been handed to EPA. It's basically a tax program. Okay? It's not a regulatory program, it's a tax program. It's handed to EPA and it's enforceable by EPA under the Clean Air Act, which has large daily fines for violating emissions limits. So in this case, every decision that you make along the lines of calculating those numbers is an auditable event. So did you calculate your 25,000 tons right? Within that, did you calculate your pneumatic controllers correctly? All of them, individual. Did you calculate your ratio correctly? However they choose to do it, did you accurately describe your sales volume? Are you really complying? What's the compliance test? And that kind of enforcement is embedded in EPA's enforcement office, which is a very aggressive operation and has a history in this industry of seeking out more vulnerable producers and going after them first. So one of the threshold issues can be, were you above or below 25,000 tons? How do you prove that? So all of these things are going to be sorted out over the next couple of years, with the first piece of which will be looking at this EPA implementing regulatory proposal that they'll probably come out with sometime over the next several months. in order to be ready for the 2024 period. But as we've talked to them, one of the things we've tried to emphasize is you've got to make sure that when you put this out, that it is clear how you fill it out. And if you do it that way, that you're not going to be subjected to excessive enforcement by the EPA Enforcement Office. That's probably too long of an answer for you.
No, you've created a whole series of follow-up questions from that. Let me also urge everyone that if you do have a question you want me to pass on, you can use your chat or Q&A button, and I'd be happy to incorporate your question in.
I would also say the work that you did through your ESG Dynamics group that kind of lays out, I'm sure you've shared that with this group, but it's a really useful visual to show you how these calculations can bear on different size operations based on what people have done in the past.
Well, I appreciate the advertisement. I didn't even pay you for that. So that's and what he's referring to is that we did Bloomberg did a piece talking about who was going to be fined and hit certain amounts. And from our numbers, they had some exactly right on, and you had others that were significantly off. And don't know where they got their numbers. Where we got ours is from the EPA greenhouse gas subpart W and public information. So it's either people don't know how to define those formulas, or they're using wrong data. Could have an effect either way. So you brought up a point about the vulnerable companies. I used to always think that they would go after the Conocos and the Chevrons, the big boys, because then they've got the target on the back. But what I've started seeing in New Mexico is that they're going after the smaller, mid-size, and just pimp slapping the poo out of them. How about that for a technical
That's
term?
a great visual.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's, so it kind of fits more with your point about the vulnerable and the ones that are not as able to defend themselves. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, well, that's what we've seen in the past. I'll give you an example. In the early regulations that dealt with vapor recovery on tanks. This is the 2012 subpart quad O new source performance standard requirements. When you do these things through the Clean Air Act, typically the regulatory authority is delegated to the states. So in Texas, the implementing agency for those regulations was Texas TCEQ or the Railroad Commission, or probably TCEQ because it's an air regulation. And for EPA to enforce it, it has to give the state the opportunity to do that. So if you go to a state where the state hasn't been delegated authority, then EPA can walk over them and do their own enforcement activity. North Dakota turned out to be a state that had not gotten delegation of new source performance standards for oil and gas production because it was a minor issue until those rules came out. And so what we saw happen up there was when the rule was being developed, the technical people at EPA explained how the rule was supposed to operate, and people were implementing it based on that guidance. But the enforcement office interpreted it a different way. And they were saying that people who were operating as they thought they were operating in compliance were not. So what they chose to do was not go after a big producer, but to go after a private company with a huge potential fine that would effectively try to just level that company, forcing them to then come in and negotiate with EPA on making changes to do what EPA wanted to do, or face them in court. And typically the idea is you get from you not only get them to agree to change the way they're operating the equipment that's under regulation, but to do other things that aren't even a part of the regulatory tool. This one, it's an open invitation because it's a totally federal program, which gives the compliance people at EPA the opportunity to just walk into any place and go after producers. And our based on watching what they've done in the past, trying to go after a mid-sized, particularly privately held company that has limited resources is a a potential tactic that I think we're very concerned about them using as the way to operate this. And since so many of these terms are undefined and you're dealing with an audit issue, anybody can make interpretations that are in reasonable bounds as to how to make certain calculations, but the lawyers can challenge that judgment, and that's one of the risks we see with this thing, and as it's depending upon how it's implemented by EPA when they come up with their regulations.
So take that point and focus on Texas and New Mexico, because that's where most of our folks are involved. How would that manifest itself within Texas, New Mexico for those operators?
Well, again, because this is a federal only program, the state is not a player in the tax. It's a player in the regulatory piece, but it's not a player in tax. So the EPA would have the ability to come in and examine, anybody's reports, anybody's Subpart W reports, as a basis to determine whether or not they calculated their emissions correctly, and challenge them if they choose to. I think, so for example, one of the areas that I'm kind of personally concerned about is if you're operating today and you're, like in 2014 or not, in 2020, 2022, you're emitting 27,000 tons a year in a basin. And now you've gone in with a major program to replace high bleed pneumatic controllers or improve your maintenance of your intermittent pneumatic controllers. And now you drop down to 23,000 tons. So now you're below the threshold, but they have a record that shows that you were above it a couple of years earlier. So that's kind of like a red flag on your tax return. It's like they have the ability then to say, what did they do to drop that 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 tons a year, and did it really happen? So now they can move in that direction, and that's going to be at the smaller end of producers. At the larger end, I think a lot of it will tend to be. They can still look at every assumption you've made on your 25,000 or your calculation of methane emissions, but it's also going to get into this ratio. How did you calculate the ratio? Did you do it properly? Are your sales numbers correct? Did you elevate your sales numbers somehow to make it look like your emissions threshold is lower? All of those are things where the enforcement office could try to pursue activities, and whether it's valid or not, it's going to cost people money.
So if I'm that target company or potential target company, what do I need to be doing through this process? And you do all this and you might not get audited, but then if you get audited 2 years from now, you're going to wish like everything you had done certain things. What are those certain things? It sounds like you need to document your process.
You really need to document what you've done, and you need to document how you made your calculations. And that's particularly true if there are different ways you can make the same you can calculate numbers on the same piece of equipment. For example, in its Subpart W proposal that EPA put out last year and hasn't finalized, one of the things on intermittent pneumatic controllers is it gave you two different ways to calculate the number. One was sort of just a flat emissions factor times the number of controllers. One of them allowed you to break out controllers between those that were operating properly and those that were not. And you got a much lower emissions factor on one and a higher on the other, but collectively you probably got a much lower number than the flat emissions factor. If you use that pathway, that means you're going to really have to be able to show that you in fact have the right numbers of controllers in the right pockets, if you will, for those calculations. So anything where there's a decision point that can be made, you have to be careful about making it. Conversely, if you just you're exposing yourself potentially to higher taxes, if you do, you can do it exactly the way they want it. But if their numbers are high and you think they're high and you know that you're not emitting that much, you're going to be faced with paying more money. So all these things can be, and I think, and it's also important, and of course, this is obviously something that we're trying to work on at IPAA. When they come out with this rule, it's really important to understand what the consequences of those rules are and make sure that the record is filled with why certain things need to be done the way they are to be accurate. And then we'll see if, it's unlikely this thing is going to get turned around anytime soon. But I have some hope that Congress will look at the way they passed this and recognize that they've created a timeline that's unworkable if you really want accurate numbers, and give EPA both the time and the money to do the job correctly. Then we'll see whether, if by then you've got all the methane rules in place, it's possible that that it won't raise that much money, and it's just a big waste of time for calculating.
Unfortunately, you might be the only one on this call that has that hope that Congress will see the light and do something. So
it's tough. I mean, you've got a tight majority in both houses. Republicans and Democrats haven't been exactly negotiating well with each other in the past decade or so. Then you have a Democratic president who is, locked in with an intense effort to try to, in his words, eliminate fossil energy. So it's a big challenge.
So a couple of things you've alluded to coincided with a conversation I had yesterday with the EHS person about how you have a lot of the subpart W all is very formulaic. It's like, how many components do you have? It goes in, it's calculated, and it produces a certain number, versus going out and really, like on pneumatics or anything, and looking and seeing how often they really work and doing more of a actual testing of it. And it could have a huge effect on what your resulting values are.
Yeah.
It's that seems to fit into this whole tax and fines and all, but to be able to do that, you've got to be able to document that, understand how to calculate it. Thoughts on that?
Well, one of the elements of this new law is directing EPA to revise subpart W to make it more empirical in nature. And I mean, theoretically, what I'm interpreting that to mean is they want EPA to go out and really look at their emissions calculations process, and get accurate information to make the calculations as good as possible, so they're really reflecting a current state of emissions, not what things look like in 1997. It's, as everybody I'm sure on this kind of call recognizes, you can't measure all these emissions at a site. I mean, it's just impossible. But at the same time, the work that's been done in the past hasn't been as robust as it should be for this type of a program. If you're going to put substantial tax dollar or taxing, or going to put substantial costs on the emissions, then the emissions numbers need to be far better than they have ever been so far. They were never designed for this purpose. That's the underlying problem. But that's more, to me, that is more than a 2-year task, which is essentially now an 18-month task or something like that. Because time is shrinking before that 2024 deadline. And to really go out and do a study on, I think it's roughly 40 components that have emissions factors in the upstream space, in the production space, and make sure that they reflect things like what service they're in, what kind of activation goes on in the operations, liquid versus gas valves, those kind of things are not given that much history in the factors that are there now. That's really something that in my view takes a robust amount of research, because it could be different east and west. It certainly be different north and south. with temperature impact.
Clearly.
And you know, size of facility can make a difference. How frequently things operate would be involved in the factor. If you're not, if you're running your wells a couple of days a week, a small well a couple of days a week, you're not going to have the same kind of emissions profile as a big hydraulically fractured operation in the middle of a 20 well pad. Those differences are things that are missing in larger in EPA's understanding of the industry, but certainly in the congressional mandate here. So EPA needs to be given more time, and it needs to be given adequate funding to go out and actually do this kind of work. And then it needs to be done in a scientific fashion.
We're running out of time, but I've got two questions I definitely want to get to. One, when we were visiting before this started, we talked about that 25,000 ton limit, and I made the comment about if you're below that, you're okay, and you didn't necessarily agree with that. Tell me your concerns. There's a lot of companies out there that say they're below 25,000 and are avoiding all this. Should they be worried?
Which is sort of my concern is the reason why the 25,000 was selected 15 years ago or whenever they started the greenhouse gas inventory was the EPA recognized that it looked at 10, it looked at 25, I think it looked at 100, and it picked 25 because for this industry, because it realized that the amount of emissions below that were going to be relatively small, but the burden of filling out all the forms are going to be large. You're going to bring in maybe 8,000 new responders, but you weren't going to get that much more information. And they could, for their purpose at that time, they could, figure out a way to estimate what they weren't collecting information on based on what they did collect information on. So, so as a result, people would look at it and there'd be kind of, rough guidelines as people say, well, I'm below 25,000. I'm okay. I don't have to fill out these forms, and they don't know how to fill out the forms. So now if I'm an aggressive enforcement guy, I'm looking around to figure out who out there might be avoiding this by not filling out the forms properly. And that's where my worry on that particular issue is, with my past exposure to the enforcement people at EPA, that there will be some of them that are going to be trying to look at that margin and hunt for the people that aren't filing properly, even though if they're just a little bit above 25,000, they may not have much of a tax. It's that mindset of we're going after the people that aren't, filling out the, aren't that should be in the pool and they aren't. And so as a producer who's never been in the pool, because you've never thought you were 25,000, now you got to worry about making sure that you can prove that.
And just from our own personal perspective from ESG Dynamics, when we've done some studies and we show mid-sized companies where their greenhouse gas and some of the things they filed with EPA don't match with their state filings. And so if they can't even file things consistently and accurately, I can only imagine what the smaller players are going to. I think it really starts putting a lot of emphasis on filing things accurately and transparently and consistently.
Yeah, on both ends, I think, and the question is whether the EPA end of it will stand up to that. Will they give you the kind of direct guidance that you need to make sure you can make that calculation? We had this issue arise in a different way in one of the regulatory proposals. EPA was saying, well, we're not going to require regulations on sources, wells that emit less than 3 tons a year of methane. And the point we were trying to make to them was, when they're that low, those people aren't calculating those emissions. They're not filling out subpart W. That's why, that's why they're not filling it. And so if you're going to ask them, if you're going to make that the condition of being regulated or not, you need to give them like a subpart W for dummies guide, so they can figure out, am I in or out fairly easily. You don't. And I don't know with this thing that you can do it easily because of the potential now that you've got a tax implication to it.
Yeah. So last question. I know we're a little out over time, but you brought up something I wasn't aware of about the Texas legislature talking about state laws preventing the state from adhering to certain federal regulation. I don't know how much you know about all that. It sounds like it's all happening pretty current, but to me that in one way you're like, great, Texas is stepping up for us, but then it looks like it could be a state and a federal battling each other.
Now,
what do you know about that?
Well, this is more in the context of the methane EPA regulations themselves, because particularly for existing sources, what they're doing is creating emissions guidelines. The states then have to develop plans to show that they're going to regulate all these existing sources, which are of course the biggest pool. I mean, it's 1 million out there, right? And the way EPA has kind of crafted the process for doing that seems to be putting its thumb on the process in a way that is likely to create some tension between states and EPA over how they regulate. Because most states have their own way of regulating. It's not exactly the way EPA does. So there's always a negotiation that has to happen. But if the state doesn't produce a plan that EPA can approve, then EPA has to create a federal plan and implement it. So when you get into these ideas of saying, well, if we don't like their regulations, we're not going to do them. From the producer standpoint, that means you're going to have a state regulation, and then you're going to have an EPA regulation. And you're going to have to meet both of them. And now you've also got EPA enforcement coming in that if there's a state rule and they have a state approved plan, EPA can't walk over them. And now they wouldn't have that constraint. So that's when I understand why people say, hey, let's just tell them we're not going to do that crazy program if that's the way they view it. But the way the Clean Air Act is written, frankly, many others, Clean Water, RCRA, it's designed to be a federal state partnership. And if the state doesn't take the lead role, then it gives EPA the mandate to come in and regulate federally. And now as a producer, you've got two masters.
Most of what I'm seeing, it's the state coming after the producer. So I'm going to throw this out and you can definitely slap me back down. But so shouldn't I be more worried about the state and not the EPA? Because the chance of the EPA finding me as a small producer seems like the likelihood of that isn't as much as the state doing it.
It is more likely that the state would be the primary regulator. They're intended to be the primary. So they've got the staff, they've got the structure, they've got the basic.
More local, yeah.
EPA is not going to, first of all, it's not going to have the experts. It's not going to have enough staffing to do all of this. But that means it also can cherry pick. It can decide who it might want to go after, whether that's equitable or not, whether they're really a bad actor or not. It's the dynamic that they're hanging out there someplace and you don't know when they might show up. It's like a tax audit, I suppose. You don't know who they're going to pick or why, but the threat is hanging out there and it makes you nervous, or most people nervous.
Very good. Well, Lee, I told you 30 minutes firm, and then you proceeded to be too interesting. So I drug this out 10 minutes more. And you answered one more question for me that now I agreed with your comment that Steve Pruitt is very smart. Now I understand where he gets a lot of his brilliance, because he's probably listening to you and just regurgitating a lot of what you've taught him, or that's what I'm going to at least tell him when I see him. But Lee, thank you very much. IPAA sounds like doing a lot of good things for the industry and very helpful education and lobbying. So I appreciate all that y'all are doing and for you to be on here.
I was happy to join you. Appreciate you inviting me.
All right, everyone, look forward to seeing y'all in May when we'll have another good presentation. Sarah Stogner talking about kind of water and orphan wells, and should be very lively. Thanks, everyone.